Dr. Nina Gren holds a PhD in social anthropology and is employed as a researcher at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Lund University, and as an external lecturer at the Department of Anthropology, University of Copenhagen. Dr. Gren is actually going to speak to us now on caring for patrilocality while adjusting to Israeli bordering processes. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you for that presentation. I actually don't work in Copenhagen anymore. I used to do that,
okay.
But I'm only in Lund, but never mind. I slightly adjusted my title to make it a bit clearer. So the presentation is about family unification. So I will discuss some of the ways that the Israeli settler colonial project and military occupation hinder Palestinian family life through a legal framework on family unification. In addition to, as you all know, a complex ID card regime and restricted mobility, which is upheld by military infrastructure and military practices and force. So I will use this quite nerdy anthropological concept, patrilocality. And it means that a newly married couple normally establishes their new household close to the husband's family. So this is with the settlement pattern that anthropologists call patrilocality. And you should note that this is not patriarchy that I'm speaking about, the male dominance of women, but this is how you live, how you arrange your living arrangements. And in this research project, I have noticed that the living arrangements among some Palestinians, people who have different legal statuses in the same family, it's increasingly adjusted to the law on family unification. And this threatens earlier ways of doing family, basically. So I will show how the changes in settlement pattern, due to which is basically a ban on family unification, between Palestinians with different ID cards indirectly shape people's ability and sometimes even their willingness to uphold moral obligations towards family members who are living a bit far away, which is of course not the case. And I'm sure many of the Palestinians here are quite familiar with these problems. And I understand these adaptations, I'm gonna go ahead, yeah. I understand these adaptations as outcomes of bureaucratic violence. So you can think about bureaucracies that they provide us with access to rights, but they can also impact us in other ways by being constraining and humiliating, soul-killing, and sometimes even life-threatening. And I have to mention one case. I've been doing research also in Europe with the refugees, and one of my colleagues, Torun Elsrud, she had fantastic interview material with Afghan asylum seekers in Sweden, who said that the migration board is killing us with the pen, and that's very illuminating, I think. And this bureaucratic violence is perhaps most disturbing, of course, in a settler colonial context. So when research on bureaucracy have been linked to research on violence, it is quite clear that violence is enacted and preserved through administration and decision-making in different contexts. And here it's also important, I think, to remember that different forms of violence interconnect, they mingle, and they lead to one another in a kind of violence continuum. So maybe it's not always so fruitful to decide, is this purely bureaucratic violence, or is this symbolic violence, or whatever, but there is, in some disturbing situations, different ways of being violent for the one in power. And this bureaucratic violence, it also assaults people's integrity and dignity and sense of worth. And in the US colonial context, bureaucratic violence has, for instance, been defined as the ways through which institutions alienate and dominate Native Americans. So that means that indigenous cultures and modes of living are ignored and renounced, and in similar ways, Israeli bureaucracy also reacts Palestinian ways of living and inflict social transformation. I build on an ethnographic fieldwork that I've done the last year, that I was carried out with the help of a Palestinian field assistant. And my main focus here has been on Palestinians who live in the West Bank, but who are married to someone from, I hesitate which words to use here, if it's the border. As we know, Israel doesn't really have any internationally recognized borders, or if we should use the word the Green Line, which is the old armistice line from 1949, and so on. But anyway, I think you know what I mean. And historically, marriages between Palestinians who live in different places in historical Palestine has of course been common because people belong to the same social networks and national community. And earlier, these marriages also brought social and economic opportunities in a very fragmented landscape of military no-go areas and settlements and army posts and checkpoints and so on, and of course, more recently, the wall. In addition to this complex and bureaucratic permit system that exists. It basically meant that by marrying someone with another legal status, you might get access to the job market, for example, inside Israel. In 2002, during the Al-Aqsa Intifada, or the Second Intifada, the Israeli government put a hold on all applications for family unification between people who are citizens inside Israel and their Palestinian partners from the occupied territories. And this decision was, of course, I would say, justified by security concerns after a so-called suicide bomber had acquired residency. Should I stop? Yeah. No. Okay, so during the Al-Aqsa Intifada, is it working? Yeah, okay. During the Second Intifada, or the Al-Aqsa Intifada, the Israeli government put a hold on applications for family unification between Palestinians who are Israeli citizens and Palestinians who lived in the occupied territories. And this decision was justified by security concerns, but of course there are also other reasons for this. The status of Jerusalem, what is sometimes called the demographic race, the Israeli state not wanting to lose a Jewish majority within Israel. And the year after, there was a new law implemented that is nearly a total prohibition on family unification between Palestinians with different statuses. And this law has, of course, been criticized by the UN and different NGOs because it's disastrous for many Palestinian couples and families. So, for example, it means if you relocate to Israel because you have gotten married, as a spouse from the occupied territory, you risk criminal prosecution if found by the police without the right permit. It means that you can be deported and forcibly separated from your family. It also affects your access to health care and the job market, if you can drive a car inside Jerusalem, and a number of issues. So as expected, when I did interviews, it was quite clear that the restrictions on family unification have a very large impact on everyday life of certain Palestinian couples and families. And those families are very often involved in lengthy and expensive legal processes, trying to avoid losing Jerusalem ID cards or to gain the right for a West Bank spouse to stay in Israel. So it's basically two things going on here. And they are trying to accommodate the Israeli restrictions by specific living arrangements. In some cases, it means establishing several households or living in legally ambivalent areas within the municipality of Jerusalem, such as Kufr Aqab, for example, on the way to Ramallah. And they are forced to open their homes to Israeli civil servants who are checking their fridges and their wardrobes in attempts to make sure that the Palestinians live in the places they say they live and according to the family unification process. And my point in this paper is not that these strategies and adaptations exist. It's quite natural that they do, but how the practices interact with Palestinian family ideals and sometimes make it impossible to live up to family obligations. So as I already mentioned, at marriage, a Palestinian woman normally moves to her husband's family, patrilocality. The new couple will be part of a husband's extended family, who often shares one or several buildings in the same neighborhood. Other living arrangements are existing for different reasons, such as economic opportunities or personal preferences, job opportunities, and all different ways, things. But patrilocality, I would say, is actually the norm. And here it's important to remember that everywhere in the world, people become family not only by biology or genetic ties, but by doing things together, by, for instance, eating together, by celebrating feasts and helping one another with the things in their everyday lives. So family bonds are in constant making and they need to be nurtured. But however, many of my interlocutors who came from these families with members holding different ID cards, living arrangements were chosen on the basis of succeeding to get family unification rather than patrilocality. So to put it blunt, paper trumps tradition right now. So for instance, if a family have a father from the West Bank and a mother from Jerusalem, they will often not follow the patrilocal norm of living close to his family, but rather arrange themselves in an area that is considered part of Jerusalem or next to the woman's family. So for example, I had one interviewee who I call Marwan. He has been living with his wife, who is from Jerusalem, for more than 20 years. During the years, they have arranged themselves differently. At long periods of time, they have lived in different places. He has lived with his birth family, patrilocally, while she and the kids have been living inside Jerusalem. And only very recently, they have officially been living together in Jerusalem. One complication with this is that Marwan, he actually owns a quite nice house close to his family in the West Bank, but they can't live there. But they have to rent an apartment inside Jerusalem, which costs a fortune. But right now he has a temporary ID card in Jerusalem that needs to be renewed within 2 years. Some of my interlocutors, they hinted that they regretted their marriages because it's so stressful to have different ID cards, or at least they would strongly recommend others to not get into these kind of relationships. So another of my informants, a woman I call Dina, she has a Jerusalem ID card. She was born in Jerusalem, but when she married her husband from the West Bank, she moved to him and his family as is customary. And this has meant that she is risking her Jerusalem ID card, and now she's in the process of divorcing her husband. I'm sure there were other reasons as well for divorcing him, but that's one of the reasons, at least. So you could say here that gender is absolutely vital. For a man, if applying for family unification, it might mean that you give up on patrilocality. For a woman, living patrilocally might mean that you risk your ID card if you have a Jerusalem ID card. So it depends on your legal status in combination with your gender. So the point here is that if you live far from your close relatives on the male side, it also gets difficult to do family the ideal Palestinian way. Because the father's family is the one who is the most important family relations, most often at least, and they risk being weakened. And it was especially clear for some people in the younger generation because they meant that the relations to their father's family were experienced as rather superficial since they did not grow up in the proximity of their father's families. So they did not meet them or talk to them very often, and they rarely shared meals with them. They couldn't help them in their everyday lives and so on. And this is quite the opposite to the family ideal in which the father's extended family is the most significant of your kin. The ones you can rely on and who can rely on you. So here is a quote from one of my interviews with Salim, who grew up in Jerusalem with his mother from Jerusalem and his father from West Bank. And his father's village is quite far away in a remote area on the West Bank, so they can't visit them very often. And Salim, he liked his father's village very much, but he also felt as a stranger in that place to some extent. And even more disturbing was the fact that he couldn't help his elderly female family members the way he would have liked. So he said, my grandma's last years, it was too much for her. So we went back and forth more. She passed away, and now my aunt is basically the same as grandma. She had a stroke a year ago. Half her body is paralyzed, but maybe it's less stressful for my dad now because he's retired. So he goes there and he stays for a week also. So in this case, the wish and the need to care for one's family is still very important for Salim, but it's complicated and difficult because of ID card regime and the permit regime and the Israeli authorities' demands on those who apply for family unification. But I also had some case among the younger interviewees where a person really felt that they were neglected by their father's family and his relatives who lived far away at the other side of the border. So one girl, a young woman who lives in the West Bank with her mother, while her father is an Israeli citizen and lives inside the 48 areas, she said, not even my father's brothers care much. They never come to visit us in the West Bank, not even in Ramadan. So I'm coming to the end of the presentation. So I think this, except from family unification, of course, affecting the status of Jerusalem and demographic issues and so on, this is also an imposed social transformation. I don't know if it will threaten patrilocality in the long run, but it's definitely doing something with it. Because the ban on family unification, it's a type of bureaucratic violence that suits a settler colonial project quite well, since it creates divisions among the local Palestinian population and gives different groups and individuals with certain ID cards, certain privileges under Israeli rule. So there are boundaries, hierarchical social taxonomies, and privileges that are established between individuals within the same society, basically. And meanwhile, the settler colonial project also ignores and renounces traditional ways of living, and many Palestinian couples and families are adjusting their lives as to obtain family unification and not lose their ID cards and the rights attached to it. So currently, paper trumps tradition, as I said, and it means that individuals and families need to move and adjust themselves to not living patrilocally. By extension, then abandoning patrilocality, it also means that some family relations, supposedly the most important, are weakened, since doing family demands closeness and needs to be constantly remade and nurtured. And I think that there's so many horrible things going on here. So of course you can question why I focus on bureaucratic violence. There's also very direct physical violence. People are getting killed. But I think it's important to understand things like these bureaucratic processes as well, because they are interacting and are definitely making things worse in everyday life. And I don't think that it would be possible for Israel to be engaged in the kind of bureaucratic violence that they are if there wasn't a threat of direct violence, right? If there wasn't checkpoints with armed soldiers and the risk of getting killed and so on. So thank you so much.